Okay, so Katie's topic is called A Labour of Love, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The impact of the National Disability Insurance Scheme on the relationship between the care worker and the care receiver. Now, let me see, where did my slide? Here we go. So Katie is a PhD student at the University of Western Australia, and her project explores the experiences of support workers engaged in the NDIS to understand the ways that the current national reforms to the funding of care are transforming in the care labour. She's passionate about the value of applying anthropological knowledge to the community service sector, particularly in areas of social health and social organisation design. Through her role as service designer with Anglicare WA, Katie works with staff and service users to make sense of the relationship between people and services and to collaboratively design programs that create new possibilities for people who are vulnerable or marginalised and enable them to thrive. So, Katie, let's hear it from you. You are muted still. There we go.
Cool. Thanks very much, Dorinda. So, and to everyone who's been organising these seminars, I've loved being able to come to more than I normally would have been able to come to, so that's great. So that is the title. I'm just going to work out. Okay, so what I'd love to discuss, actually, sorry, I'm just going to put my timer on. There we go. What I'd like to do through this presentation today is give you all a bit of an idea of my research project and methods, and share my conceptual framework so that you can hopefully give me some thoughts or suggestions for other things that I might like to explore. So to do that, I'll go through a little bit of the context, the contextual background, so about the NDIS, and then look at my interests, so the support workers within that. Then to explore some of the key tools and approaches that I'm using and the significance of my project. So I think often, we're starting to hear this term cropping up a lot. It's a bit trendy around the future of work. And I think when we often imagine, what the future of work's going to look like, we might think of this kind of dystopian scenario like this where robots are doing everything, but arguably I think the future of work will actually be less about self-driving cars, clean energy and cryptocurrency, and actually a lot more about care. So the Future Social Service Institute states that in future more and more Australians will be accessing social services and support every year, and that the ever-increasing demand for care will have a profound impact on the future of work and workers. And the social service workforce has become and will continue to remain Australia's fastest growing workforce. So we're going to be seeing a lot more care in the future, particularly because it's estimated that we need possibly 1.7 million people, and that's million additional workers, to support the rollout of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So I'm really interested in the lived experiences of people that we pay to provide care, which means that I've really had to grapple with the NDIS, because it's changing care. It's changing who provides it, who pays for it, and who receives it. So some of us might be familiar with the NDIS, some might not. So I think it's probably helpful to just give a little bit of background to that. So it was introduced in 2013, and it's a national reform to the way that the Commonwealth Government delivers care to people with physical and psychosocial disabilities. So when they say psychosocial, what they mean is it also kind of covers mental health as well, or people with mental illness, which is quite different. It's a real departure from previous ways that the government sort of dealt with care for people with disabilities or people with mental health issues. And it's modelled on market principles. So this assumption that competition between service providers is going to result in better service delivery and, of course, more efficient use of public money. And we see that it's really justified through this empowerment discourse. So you can see there in the image on the right, freedom to choose, and you see it's all over. It's all about choice and control. So the NDIS gives you more choice and control over how, when and where your supports are provided. So while we see, the NDIS in Western Australia has particular history, but it's also set against global trends towards the individual funding for care, which is also referred to elsewhere as direct payments, cash for care, individual budgets, a bunch of different things. So I just want to have a look at what that is. So before we can do that, though, I want to look at where it's kind of come from, these funding regimes. So prior to the 20th century, the Commonwealth government actually didn't provide any financial assistance to people with disabilities at all, or any services, until 1908, when they introduced the invalid pension. And then sort of things shifted a bit, and we ended up in this space where people with disability were supported with accommodation. So they're actually removed from their families and supported to live in institutions. And then we kind of went back from that, and we had the deinstitutionalisation movement up to about the 1970s, before we had the community-based care movement, which was where people with disability were supported to live in their homes, and that was because there was funding that was provided to carers to stay home and look after them. But then we see this kind of shift in the funding model towards individual funding in the 2000s. So we've gone from this idea of, the government giving money to things other than people with disability, really. So it's either the service providers usually, to deliver a service. And now what we have is they've changed the way the money is moving around. So in individual funding, what happens is the government is providing funds to the people that need care, and then they can purchase services. So they have their NDIS market approach, document, and they stated the aim of the scheme is to create a radically new disability marketplace where people with disability can choose their supports through individualised commissioning. So we're kind of seeing that real kind of language again around these responsible, independent subjects. And how do we get to this marketplace? It's by moving the money around in different ways. So if you're someone with, as they define, a permanent or significant disability, the government gives you like a little pot of money that you can use to purchase care in the form of labour. So you're purchasing care labour from someone that is typically referred to as a support worker. So voila, we have created a care marketplace. Now this is grossly oversimplified, and I'd love to, there's actually a lot more nuances in how the funding works, particularly where I've got this yellow bubble here that I won't go into now. But essentially what's happening is the money's kind of moving around in new ways, and it's creating this arguably quasi-care market, which has resulted in a bunch of interesting market responses, really interesting. So I'm going to show you an example now in a video, because I think that really captures the kind of stuff that we're seeing popping up.
I'd like to find my daughter a support worker after class on Wednesdays who loves to cook and is into salsa dancing.
Mabel is the website that's revolutionising disability support. It lets you find and choose people offering the support that you want. And because we're online, it's easy and affordable. Find your people at mabel.com.au.
So to me, this is just fascinating. Like, what are the relationships that we get out of that? Like, it's almost like Uber for care or Tinder for care, but then at the same time, like, what does that mean? What does that mean for that paid care relationship? Like, is that person, are they friends? Is it support? Like, what is it? And I'm just fascinated by this. And so it's like, well, how do we make sense of this? And there's a whole lot of literature actually that looks at, how this kind of combination of market principles and these individualised self-directed approaches is changing relationships between individuals and governments. But there's less so that kind of looks at how ethnographic exploration of how it's changing relationships or impacting relationships between care workers and care receivers. So then I had to, well, how do we go about making sense of this? And so the key concept here that I've looked at is care, which is the term care, I think, has some quite certain connotations, and particularly if you look at, within the disability studies literature, there's been a whole shift away from the language of care, because it's kind of seen as the kind of reducing the kind of agency or presenting, people who need care as somewhat passive. But when we look at some of these definitions within the social sciences, it's actually defined in a really broad sense. So I really like this definition, Fisher and Tronto's definition, which popped up in the 90s, because they broke care down into these different components, and each component could kind of be it could have different people responsible for those different components. So caring about is that idea of we're identifying a need. So you can identify the need that someone, you know, has a broken leg, for example. So here's a person who needs social support. Then there's the idea of caring for, which is that there's a responsibility to meet that need, where it's saying that something needs to be done. So, and just because the need exists, it doesn't mean that anyone in particular actually has to do anything about it. So that's how caring for is different to that, you know, caring about. Then caregiving is the actual, what we tend to think of usually as care, like it's the actual work of providing care, the labour of meeting those needs. And then care receiving. So how do we know if the care was successful in meeting that need? You know, as the person said, yep, cool, you know, you've helped me down the stairs with my broken leg, thanks, I'm done now. Or have you made an assessment to go, oh yeah, they look like they're right. And then there's, so Tronto kind of revisits this in 2015 and looks at the idea of caring with, which is to kind of balance out this idea that if, you know, the care is ultimately an unbalanced relationship, you know, there's a differential of power there, I guess. And so how do we kind of even out those within a society so that we're not getting always the same people, you know, providing the care and receiving the care and that sort of thing. And that's where that kind of concept of caring with comes in. But what's really important here is care is always relational. Like it always requires someone who is in need of care and then someone who's providing it, even if the people that are doing these different component parts might change. So I think we can't talk about care without talking about relationships. And when we think about care relationships, we see that they actually enacted, or they're occurring at lots of different levels of relationships. So for example, so you might have a family with someone who they have a daughter who has an intellectual disability, and they care about their daughter. You know, they're identifying that she has certain needs. So then they might, the government also they care for this person as well. So they're kind of saying, yeah, you know, we kind of accept some sort of responsibility here to ensure this person has their needs met. And then, you know, we get some care funding and we go to a care organisation and they they also care for, you know, possibly the family and also the care receiver. So they're accepting a level of responsibility there. And then they've engaged a care worker who's actually providing, you know, helping to meet that person's needs if it's around social support or whatever it is. And so the care worker is the person doing the caregiving, but interestingly, also the organisation, they might also care for and give care to the care worker. Because, you know, they need to make sure that they're, you know, happy in their work and not you know, not feeling too stressed. And then also potentially as this care worker supports someone out into the community, you know, the other people in the community start to identify and know who this person is and care for them too. And also they might care for the care worker because they see the great job that they're doing. So it's all these kind of different layers, very networks of relationships. So when I was kind of really interested in this, I've got a writing coach and he kept going to me like, what do you, he wanted me to be really clear with my terms, and he kept being like, what are you trying to measure? Like, stop hiding in language. Like, what are you looking at? And I really didn't know, like, what am I looking at? And so I started to look around to try and identify things that would help me think about, well, how do I go out into the field and make sense of this? And so, so when so I like this Goffman's idea, of course, of talking about this idea that human relationships occur in their own sort of domain. So then we might think, well, what is the domain of this care worker, care receiver relationship? And Gubrium kind of defines this as it's this human service domain. And so then what I kind of did was thought, oh, well, let's look at the literature around relationships that seem to fall within this domain. and, you know, how are they kind of described? And it's really interesting, actually. So they're described in all sorts of different ways. So, you know, in the medical literature, obviously you've got, you know, your doctor or practitioner and patient, and then this notion of employee and employer. We see that popping up a lot in the disability studies literature, because again, they're saying like the person with the disability is actually is the employer of the support worker, who is the employee. And so they're trying to kind of reverse that, what they see as that power differential. And we also see there's a really interesting term that crops up, professional friendship. So I think we see that a bit in the literature around mentoring for people with mental health. But then there's this really interesting debate that pops up in the social science literature. And it's kind of like two ends of the spectrum. So on the one end, we've got, you know, these sociologists where they're talking about the commoditisation of care within aged services, and they kind of use this employee-employer language, and it's very kind of this functional relationship, and it can't kind of have the space for the kind of affective side of care. But then, on the other hand, we've got, you know, the anthropological perspectives and wonderful contributions from people here today who are looking at migrant care workers, and they actually have shown that migrant care workers can enter into kin-like relationships with the people they provide support to, and so that there's really genuine caring relationships. So it's like, is it genuine or is it not? What is this? Can paid care be genuinely caring? So and then what I'm thinking, well, maybe it's not just about whether it's paid or whether it's not paid. Maybe it's about, maybe something about the way that it's paid for has something to do with it. So, so that's kind of where I'm coming from at the moment. And so my research question is really, in what ways does the funding of care impact the relationship between the care worker and care receiver? So I'm really interested in who are the people providing care, and then how they enact and interpret care as a concept, and also their responsibilities when it comes to care. How do they define the relationship, and then how do they establish and negotiate these relationships with service users? So to break this down, I've sort of been building up a little bit of a toolkit. I've called this my toolbox because I've worked in the sector for a long time, and the toolbox metaphor is a pretty common one for support workers to think of, like, okay, if you're providing social care or physical care or whatever it is, what kind of tools might you use to help you do that, or like ways of thinking or strategies? And so I kind of wanted to use that metaphor here, but I also liked it because, you know, I think tools come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and you're always adding to your toolbox as you find different tools that enable you to complete the task at hand. So definitely at the end today, I would love you to suggest any other tools that might be great for me to pop into my toolbox. But the other thing I like about it is, if you look in someone's toolbox, you know, you can tell what kind of job they do and probably where they work. And so this might give you a bit of insight into the way potentially that I'm trying to position myself as an anthropologist, and where I kind of want to get to. So for me, I think medical anthropology is quite important because it helps me to explore the ways that, you know, concepts like disability are constructed within human services. The anthropology of policy is very important for helping me to explore the experiences of different policy actors. So there we mean kind of support workers, service users, organisational staff, NDIS staff, to understand the ways that care is interpreted and enacted in the context of the NDIS. Then design anthropology, and particularly I quite like this Scandinavian tradition of workplace democracy, which focuses on the inclusion and active participation of employees in shaping their own working conditions. Now, I really haven't worked this bit out yet. I'm really kind of struggling with this a bit, but it's something that's really important to me, because one thing I've noticed within my professional life, which was really part of the inspiration for this project, is that support workers really are struggling to make sense of the relationship that they have with service users. And the traditional kind of organisational approaches of providing, you know, training or interventions that help support workers to think about professional boundaries, it just doesn't cut it, because it's kind of the relationship is shifting somehow. It's not kind of this professional relationship anymore. and particularly where agencies are now hiring a lot of young support workers, and they kind of are like, no, why can't I be friends with this person? So I think things are kind of changing, and the old methods that we had in organisations don't cut it like they used to. So I think design anthropology allows me to work with support workers and service users in this project to prototype a solution that assists them to navigate the complexities of their relationship and possibly assist their organisation as well.
Katie, you have 2 minutes.
How have I done this? I feel like I timed this and everything. This happens every time. I'm going to go over a little bit. Is it okay if I go into my question time and people can send me questions?
well, I suppose so.
It'll have to be. And, okay. So, and the competing responsibilities framework, which I think this one's really important because they kind of start with this idea of responsibilisation, so the idea that governments are divesting their obligations from the state to the individual. But the thing is, that's all about self-reliance and individual autonomy, which is very different to the responsibilities of care, which are all about recognising and responding to the needs of the other. So this framework allows me to explore the ways that service users and support workers interact interpret and enact responsibilities in ways that might challenge or coexist with this kind of neoliberal emphasis on the individual cultivation of self. Okay, I'm going to go, so basically, bit of desktop research in there. I'm not going to talk about that so much because I want to look at my field sites a bit more and share those with you. But what I kind of want to do and have broken this down is to do a bit of a comparative ethnography. So by working with 2 service providers, so one is an existing one that existed before the NDIS and has kind of restructured their whole organisation to have this kind of system of self-managing teams to support care receivers, and then a new service provider that's come up through and it relies heavily on tech. And so I'm going to recruit support workers through both of these agencies. And then what I'm going to do is some semi-structured interviews with support workers and matched pairs. So by that I mean I will with the support worker, but then the person that they provide care to as well. And then organisational staff. So again, all looking at, how do they interpret and enact this kind of concept of care and responsibilities for care. And then shadowing, which is just an ethnographic method for collecting data with people if they move around all the time, which is exactly what support workers do. They're always out in the community, they might be in an office, they might be in a person's home. So this method allows me to gather data in all of those different places. And then on top of that, I'm just going to do a couple of interviews just with some of the NDIS staff as well to look at their perspectives and then their how they think about the same concepts. So, and finally, I want to do a couple of these participatory design workshops at the end. So what I'm going to do there is take my research and my findings back to participants. I'm going to invite them all to come along to a workshop, and then together in the workshop we'll prototype some sort of solution for how they might, I guess, just make sense of their relationship with the people that they support. But also this could kind of be anything, and that's what I love about design. You never know where it's going to go, but it could be that what they find most helpful is actually, do we need a different organisational policy to help people make sense of this, or is it more about a training intervention? So I think that's something that we can kind of co-create together and use that to kind of look at the ways that organisations as well kind of interact with these relationships. So I guess I feel that there's kind of 3 ways in which my research is significant. So firstly, I really want to put a spotlight on the care workforce in Australia because it's something that we don't talk about a whole lot. And I think, if care is fundamentally relational, then we need to be talking about the people that are providing care. And, there's ideas that, yes, maybe it's a more feminised workforce, or maybe there's more migrant care workers, but a lot of my experiences within the disability space is kind of different to that. So really keen to get a better idea of, well, who are the people now that are providing care through this through the scheme, And then I'm keen to also make a contribution to this debate around, is it genuine care if you're paid? So by looking at, well, does the way that we pay for care actually have something to do with it? And then finally, I would like to contribute a challenge to this kind of neoliberal rhetoric of responsibilisation. So this idea that everyone should be this individual, autonomous, kind of self-sustaining subject. But if relationships are always part of that, then how might we look at the ways that people interpret and enact these responsibilities within their relationships? So that's it. So now I would love to hear people's questions.
Okay, thank you. That was excellent.